Hello, welcome to 2023 Stories to Watch. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time, we're very happy you're here. My name is Dasgupta. I'm the President and CEO of WRI, World Resources Institute. WRI is a global research organization with about 2,000 staff that are working to solve the world's greatest challenges. Every year around this time, we gather all our staff and ask the question what the next year will look like. What stories will be the most defining stories of next year? What I present to you is our collective wisdom. We think decisions made in 2022 will really shape this year and years to come. So before we jump into the stories to watch, we need to revisit this year quickly. We're entering the fourth year of the pandemic. The economic destruction, pain to families continues across the world. Then there was inflation, the fear of inflation. The year ended with 9% inflation, causing troubles in every economy in the world. And then in February, Russia attacked Ukraine. The tragedy in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people continues. And impacted Ukraine, impacted Europe. But something else also happened. A stronger Europe has emerged from the process, a resurgence of NATO. But most importantly, what this tragedy revealed, the interconnectedness of the global crisis. For example, the energy crisis that happened in Europe became a global crisis. 70 million people globally at risk for losing electricity this year. Food was already getting pricier early in this year, but it became a breaking point for food crisis simply because Russia and Ukraine supply over a quarter of global wheat. Global food prices surged by more than 14% in 2022. And climate impacts continued. It remained a threat multiplier across the world. The climate impact in 2022 was worse than the year before. Vulnerable people got more impacted than ever before. Take the example of Pakistan. The floods in Pakistan got 33 million people displaced. It wasn't just a humanitarian disaster, an economic disaster that reduced the GDP growth of Pakistan from 5 to 2%. And after many decades of progress in poverty reduction, because of the pandemic in the last few years, we saw poverty actually increasing for the first time in decades. And this year, because of the invasion, 95 million more people were pushed into poverty. So this year was a really difficult year. But it wasn't all bad. We think there were 4 major breakthroughs that took place last year that will shape the year to come. Decisions made by leaders and people will actually shape not only the year 2023, but years to come. First of them was, in spite of these disruption, the economic and otherwise that I talked about, global renewable energy deployment broke records. There was 8% more global renewable energy this year than the year before. And this may not be fast enough, but this transition to renewable energy or green energy continues in spite of all the crises we saw. The second breakthrough was in Montreal in December, the biodiversity conference. The global leaders came together and made a new commitment, a more ambitious commitment to protect 30% of the world's land and water. and reverse biodiversity loss. In Montreal, I saw for the first time the most business people in a biodiversity conference. This is because this real understanding of how nature and economy works. $44 trillion of global economic output, $80 trillion, is connected to nature. We think this is a turning point of how nature works, understanding how nature and the economy. The third breakthrough came earlier in the year, in the COP27 in Egypt. After 30 years of discussion, leaders of the world agreed to set up a loss and damage fund. Loss and damage fund funds climate-related losses that are not possible to recover from or adapt to. The reason this is a symbolic and important breakthrough is because for many years, vulnerable and poorer countries have said they need to receive these funds from richer countries because they did not cause this problem. This is a symbolic and a tip of the iceberg of the bigger problem of how to fund just transition in all countries. The last breakthrough came in two parts, in two opposite parts of the world. In Indonesia, there was agreement of just energy transition, JETP it's called, by a group of rich countries supporting Indonesia for their transition. $20 billion, unprecedented amount of funds for Indonesia's transition. On the other side of the globe, in the United States, the world's largest economy, took a very ambitious approach to shift the whole economy to 3 climate-related legislation. So real question for us then, will these breakthroughs remain individual breakthroughs, or they will become a beginning of systemic shift that the world needs? That they will come together to change to a more sustainable, more equitable economy and move away from incremental change to system-wide change. All the 4 stories we'll talk about actually dwells on this central question. Would we see systemic shifts that the world needs, or they will be just incremental breakthroughs? Now, let's go to our first story. Our first story is about the energy crisis. How will the conflict in Ukraine and the energy crisis in Europe impact Europe? But not only that, how it will impact the world. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was absolute weaponization of energy by Russia. Europe was dependent on Russia for 40% of its energy sources, and it was just literally stopped. As you can imagine, that impacted the whole society, across the whole economy. The price of energy went up 41%, impacting households, businesses across the economy. The energy prices raised cost of living in Europe by 7%. Millions of people fear their home won't be heated this winter. So as you can imagine, with this crisis in front of them, European leaders took drastic action. The first thing they did, very wisely, is focus on reducing the demand for gas. The second thing they did is that they tried to figure out existing coal-fired plants could be brought back online, or even sometimes expanded the life of nuclear plants. But mostly what they focused on is to find alternative source of LNG, or liquefied natural gas, from other parts of the world. They were actually quite successful. As you can see from the chart behind me, the yellow line is Russian gas, and the blue line is the alternative sources European leaders have already secured from across the world, mostly from the US, Qatar, and Nigeria. This is actually very good news. At the same time, there's a concern about this large dependence and the new investment in natural gas. Is this a natural gas trap? Would it build future overcapacity in Europe? Would it create path dependency of fossil fuel? Because the infrastructure is built, they will keep using it, and will it slow down Europe's path towards 1.5 degree or net zero by 2050? This is why Europe finds itself at a crossroads. Because natural gas, in any models that's been done to get to 1.5 degree, emissions has to steadily go down. The green line actually paints that picture. But as you can see, the investment that's been already planned and the investment that's been proposed because of the crisis, if we invested all this to build natural gas infrastructure, we will not, and Europe will not, reach 1.5 degree. That is the crossroad they face. Actually, some other people, experts across the world, feel the opposite might happen. That this crisis will actually encourage and push leaders towards greening their energy system faster, not only in Europe, but across the world. This is Fatih Birol behind me, who is the head of IEA, the International Energy Agency. One of the prominent leaders in the field, very credible. He believes that. So the question in front of us, really, if Fatih is right, will the crisis in Europe spur global shift to a low-carbon energy future? And if Fatih is right, what are the things we should be watching for? Obviously, the first thing we watch for, what happens in Europe? What will European leaders do or continue to do? Well, the good news of this crisis, if there is any, is actually it has brought European leaders closer together. Europe's energy policy is more coherent than ever and more ambitious than ever. Europe actually has been increasing its ambition in renewable energy over the years, actually since last 10 years. But this year, because of the crisis, a new program, REPowerEU, was put together that raised the ambitions, the 2030 targets, renewable energy from 40% to 45%. It doubled its solar capacity. Its investments are $224 billion in renewable energy that targets an efficiency, and actually VP Timmermans pointed out that it's going to increase its target from 55% reduction to 57% reduction by 2030. So in Europe, they're actually taking this opportunity to increase its ambition and not reduce it. So will this resolve, will this unity in Europe towards the energy policy, towards working together, continue? That is really a key thing to watch for. This kind of a transition, this kind of ambition and energy transition cannot happen without consumers being centrally part of it, with consumers actively reducing their energy demand. That's where heat pump will play a very important role. It's already playing a very important role. Heat pumps together, if deployed, can reduce 500 million tons of emission by 2030. This is the annual CO2 emission of all cars in Europe. Heat pumps not only can reduce emissions and need for energy, but also can create jobs in Europe. So a lot to look for. Will consumers be part of this revolution that has been unleashed by European leaders? This partnership with citizens and leaders is critical for this energy transition in Europe, anywhere else, and everywhere else in the world. In Europe, we see voters actually supporting the change. 83% of people in the EU think that Russia's invasion makes it more urgent to invest in renewable energy, to be much more energy independent. Other countries, I'm sure, is watching it will happen in their countries or not. This policy shifts and ambition in Europe, of course, impacts and will impact the rest of the world. It already is. What the long-term impact is, it's unclear. But right now, as you can imagine, as Europe is trying to buy LNG from all over the world, that is creating a scarcity and rising prices. So every country in the world who depends on LNG is trying to secure its source. Africa, China, India, all of them are. As they keep securing their source of LNG, they're also doing, like for example, India, investment in renewable energy. To meet India's goal of 500 gigawatts by 2030, India has to invest 25 gigawatts every year. China, who is already a renewable energy leader, continues to invest on renewable energy. So right now, we see a world where countries are investing in both renewable energy to secure energy independence, but also securing sources of fossil fuel so they don't get left out. It's unclear where we will go, but the movements from the investments in Europe is already having implication among leaders across the world. So the question for us is, this crisis and the way European policy is reacting to it, will this not only green European energy sources, or would it be an actual inflection point for the whole world, for a systemic shift? Because Europe is a very important and large economy towards making greener energy or more renewable energy the norm from the world. That is the story to watch for. Our next story is about tropical forests. More importantly, will the new leadership, especially in Brazil, help forests rebound? There is understandable excitement in the world for President Lula's election. President Lula promised, before he got elected, zero deforestation. Brazil is responsible for 40% of tropical primary forest loss. When President Lula arrived, even before he became president, at the COP in Egypt, it was actually a stir. Getting a ticket to the auditorium where he spoke was the hardest ticket to get in all of 2 weeks. Some of our team members did manage to get a ticket. I didn't. President Lula made a lot of progress in his first term in office, hence the excitement. He was able to reduce deforestation to 2-decade low. As you can see from the chart behind me, as soon as he left office, this number actually kept going up. During President Bolsonaro's time, it was a 14-year high. President Lula, during his election campaign, set a very important and extensive agenda for deforestation and for the environment. And in his first days in office, he started keeping the promise. He appointed Marina Silva, Minister of Environment, who was already part of his last cabinet and a very well-known expert on the topic. He created the first Indigenous Peoples Ministry, appointed Sonia Guajajara, a known indigenous leader, to that ministry. He opened up the Amazon Fund to see if the national capital can start flowing to the Amazon. The Amazon is not just Brazil. It's 9 countries from the Amazon basin. It's 6.8 million kilometers, the size of the continental United States. Many countries actually have new leadership. For example, Colombia has President Petro, who also has put together an ambitious plan to reverse deforestation. But Amazon basin is part of a 3-basin system of remaining tropical forest in the world. 80% of terrestrial species live in this forest, which takes only 6–7% of land in the world. Yet, this forest system provides 23% of cost-effective climate mitigation, hence its importance to us, all of us. Yet, we have not been able to protect it. Actually, the chart behind me, the magenta dots on the chart, comes from our own GFW, or Global Forest Watch tool, that shows last 20 years destruction of the tropical forest. If you just focus on Amazon, the Amazon itself has lost 18% of its original forest cover. Scientists believe that if this 18% becomes 20 or 25%, that'll be actually collapse the Amazon forest system and start looking like savanna. Not the whole thing at a time, but parts at a time. This collapse of the forest is not just important for the forest itself, for trees. 47 million people live and make a living in the Amazon basin. 10% of the world's biodiversity lives in that forest. Up to 140 billion metric tons of carbon is stored in this forest. This is a story not just about trees. It's a story of people, their livelihood, and the economy beyond just the Amazon. Hundreds of cities are in the Amazon basin. The agricultural economy of Brazil, its most important export, is dependent on the rainfall on the Amazon forest. So we need a shift not just to protect the forest, we need a shift in approach of how we think about forest and its people and the economy around it. Because this is not a problem of conserving forests, this is a development problem that we need to solve, not only in the Amazon, but all tropical forests. So the question in front of us, will President Lula's return to lead Brazil will lead to a transformation in the way we manage forests and protect tropical forests, not only in Brazil, but for the rest of the world? Will we make standing forests more valuable for people who live there than grazing pasture and destroyed forest? What do we need to watch for this to happen? The first, obviously, we need to watch for what is going to happen in Brazil. Though President Lula got elected, he faces serious opposition, both in the legislature and among governors. 14 governors are actually in the opposition party, 11 are in support of him. And just recently, you've all seen, there was an attack of democratic institutions by people in Brasilia. I just want to say, us, people in WRI, are very much with people in Brazil and in support of democratic institutions in Brazil. Second, President Lula has to figure out how to enforce existing law. 98% of deforested Brazil are illegal. And finally, much more funds are required to protect the forest and create new livelihood for people there. What are the drivers of change that are outside Brazil? They are mostly related to commodities that is produced in Brazil and bought somewhere else. So regulations in other countries are very important. For example, you put together regulation to deforestation-free supply chain. Will such regulation take hold and go to, and other countries have the same regulation? Similarly, carbon markets can play a very important role. The question really is, will we see high-quality carbon markets that not only protects, but provides the benefits to the right people in these forests? Would we also see international finance flowing to the Amazon forest? UN estimates that the natural capital, investment on natural capital, on nature-based solutions, needs to triple till 2030. Would we see similar reform take place in other tropical forests? For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Congo Basin region, both DRC and Gabon faces election next year. In DRC, new permits for oil and gas are on the table. Will that remain during the election season, or will it change? President Macron of France and President Gabon is planning a One Forest Summit in the next 2 months to highlight the importance of innovation and innovative financing for protecting forests and for deforestation. And the last tropical forest in Indonesia, which has been really a champion in the last few years, Indonesia has managed reduce deforestation. They have created a moratorium in converting primary forests to peatlands. Indonesia also faces election next year. Would this momentum in Indonesia take hold? And would all these three countries that came together in G20 summit in Indonesia to form a rainforest alliance of these three countries, will that take root? So the big question that we're really watching for, that we actually been working on deforestation for a long time. Deforestation, the problem has been well known, yet we actually haven't made a dent. Will this leadership shift in Brazil, the excitement that has come with it, will it change the path forward in Brazil and the rest of the world to not only reverse deforestation, but to create a new approach for the regions where these forests are, not only for the trees, but for the people who live there? Our next story is about financing the transition. More specifically, will reforms in 2023 unlock the funding needed, much needed, for developing countries? Before I jump into the story, I do want to make sure you and I are on the same page on the word transition. I'm talking about the whole economy transition. How do we go from where we are to an economy that's low carbon, good for nature, good for people? That transition requires financing. The bad news is the funding that's needed is just not there. Today, collectively, if you add everything that's been spent on the transition, it's about $600 billion across the whole world. But the approximate agreement, it's about $5 trillion that is needed by 2030, which is about 10 times more that is going on today and the speed at which it is increasing. And this gap between what is needed and what's there is true for every country in the world. If you look at the chart behind me, even the richer countries, Europe has a gap, North America has a gap. But for developing countries, this gap is much more acute. Africa, or the whole region, requires 8.5 times more. South Asia requires more than 10 times more investment. And these numbers don't even capture adaptation finance. So why, if it's such a good idea, why is this not happening? And you might say that there's not enough money in the world. That is actually absolutely not true. There's more than $100 trillion in just the private capital systems in the world. So let's visit for a minute, how does transition finance happen today? There are basically four sources. Domestic investment by governments, domestic private investment, which is very important for richer countries, international finance, which is MDBs or multilateral development bank like the World Bank, or bilateral funds like US aid or British aid, and international private capital, which is the most important source for this in the future because of the biggest volume. But today what's happening is the domestic public capital, which is playing a very important role currently, is getting very squeezed. If you just look at the chart behind me carefully, you will see the country's debt burden, or the country with the highest amount of debt distress, is actually doubled since 2015. This is a vicious cycle. What's happening is countries with all kinds of climate disasters, inflation, rising interest rate, actually borrowing money to support these things, their debt costs increasing. Hence, their ability to actually invest in climate transition is that much more squeezed. As I mentioned, private capital is where the most of the resources are. And private capital actually is flowing for the transition, mostly in the richer countries. So for example, in the United States, if you wanted to build a renewable energy investment, raising money would not be a difficult thing, but it is not flowing where it's needed most, to the global south. So why is it that private capital is not flowing? There are many reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that people who manage private capital think these investments are risky. They're riskier investment, hence they're hesitant to invest. As you can see from the numbers below, so it's the same project will be 14 or 15% in Nigeria and Pakistan, making a project unviable. This squeeze of funds not getting to where it needs to be and countries not being able to do what they need to do for climate and development has been going on for a while. But this year, I think because of Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who's a leader from Global South, not only she complained about it, she actually came up with a comprehensive plan that got a lot of political momentum during this year. That plan had MDB reform, debt structuring from funding, adaptation and loss and damage, a comprehensive plan to look at how the global financial system can work for developing countries and their needs. So the question is, will these financial reform that Mia Mottley and people like Mia Mottley is asking, will this reform take hold and spur the investment that is needed to support developing countries in the transition? Because if this reform doesn't take place, this transition will not happen. So what to watch for? How would we know this is happening? This transition won't happen in 1 year, but what can we watch for this year? One of the most important things that will happen immediately in the spring meetings of IMF and the World Bank is IMF and World Bank reform discussion has been going on for a while. The real thing to watch for is would these reforms will be incremental, meaning increasing the capacity of the institution to lend more, meaning a higher capital for them or reusing the assets they have to lend more. That would be incremental reform, but that would be important reform. Or would it be transformative, which is some leaders in the world has been calling for? A transformative reform would have two sides to it. One, it will stop and ask, what are this institution should be doing in 2023 to be fit for purpose? The development agenda, why this institution was set up, has changed to a climate and development agenda. Would this institution restructure themselves to actually meet the moment? Second, we all realize, and you've seen the charts behind me, that without private capital flowing, these transformations in the countries won't take place. Would they become institutions that actually spur private sector flow? Would something that the Bridgetown agenda has asked for IMF to use their assets differently, to create a climate mitigation trust, would that happen? Would other leaders come together to support this? There's an important summit being planned by the President of France and Mia Mottley to bring this together. Would we see this change? Would we see the global leaders of the G20, the richest 20 countries in the world, come together to support such reform of the institution. And not only that, support the overall transformation that is needed. The G20 countries themselves produce more than 75% of emissions in the world. So what they do and what they commit to do is a very important part of the architecture. India, which is now the president of G20 after Indonesia, has proposed a new disaster risk resilience working group. Would that work, which can give a real life to the need for funds for adaptation and loss and damage? Would we also see private sector, global private capital, actually rise to the moment? In the JETP, which is the agreement countries came together, few richer countries came together with Indonesia to actually transition their energy system in a just way, which asked for a $20 billion investment, unprecedented number. But it was also agreed 10 billion of that will be private capital. Would we see that happen? And finally, by the end of the year, when we all gather in November in Dubai, which is the next climate meeting, would we see a much more comprehensive discussion of the financing needs for the transition? Historically, the discussion has been focused on solidarity and justice of finance, correctly so. But would we see this go beyond whether we meet the $100 billion, which I absolutely hope we do this year, to a more comprehensive discussion of World Bank and IMDb reform, which was the first time part of the text in Egypt, and also discussion about how private capital needs to play an important role to solving the problem of transition finance? Would we see a much more comprehensive, robust discussion that can solve this problem and bring needed capital for transition global south? So the question for us, for this story, is will the reform Mia Mottley is calling for, will these reforms take hold in 2023 and start unlocking funding for the transition in developing countries? Would we see a turning point this year for how the financial architecture is serving the global south, and especially the vulnerable countries? Our next story is about U.S. climate action. Will the United States accelerate progress towards a just economic transition? Last year, the United States passed 3 historic pieces of laws. They focus on jobs. They experiment whether the world's largest economy can shift towards a low carbon and a more equitable economy. The most interesting thing about these 3 laws, however, the word climate doesn't feature in them. For good reasons. Because climate is not the only goal here. It's actually changed the whole economy towards a different kind of economy. The first of the laws is CHIPS and Science Act, which focuses on American-made technology, puts in $13 billion per year. The next one is bipartisan infrastructure law, called the bill. Invest in cleaner, accessible, and more sustainable American infrastructure. Puts $23 billion in the American economy every year. And the last one, the biggest one, IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the largest climate law in U.S. history, puts $43 billion every year in the U.S. economy. In addition to this, it puts $60 billion on environmental justice and health equity issues. Together, they will put 3 times more funds in the United States economy than any previous climate legislation, 3 times more. If implemented and implemented well, they have a chance of meeting Americans' carbon emission reduction goals. America's goal to reduce 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030 will get us to 40%. Rest of it will be done by state, business, and cities together. But more than climate, these laws is a major job creation opportunity. Just IRA and bill together promise to create 900,000 jobs and up to 3.1 million jobs by year 2035. Compared to that, the fossil fuel industry today in the United States together have about little more than 700,000 jobs. However, the most interesting to me, the most interesting feature, the ambition in this law is tackling historic justice issues. Climate Justice 40 feature on this law is promises to spend 40% of the benefit of climate investment for communities previously left behind or left out of climate solutions. This is a very important part of the law that focuses on making sure benefits reaches all. Of course, these goals are morally right to actually remove historical injustices that has happened through the new transition economy we're talking about. But these are also a political necessity. If people don't see, all people don't see benefits of this new economy, then we will not have the political support needed for future leaders who will produce more ambitious climate policy, because the United States and the world needs more ambitious climate policy. So the question is, will the US, implementation of all three laws, will the US be able to jumpstart a just transition to meet its climate goals while bringing economic benefit for all people? So what actions do we need to see this year to see if these goals are met? This transition will not happen in 1 year. But what needs to happen next year so that we are going in the right direction, at least we know we're going in the right direction? The first thing to watch is to make sure US will be able to accelerate renewable energy deployment, that these laws will get implemented. There are many barriers towards it. One of the big barriers is permitting reform. Right now, in some cases, it takes 10 years for permitting a new project. Other countries, like Canada and Australia, have been able to tackle these challenges by reducing the permit time while not reducing environmental goals. Will the US be able to do that? Would the environmental community be a big partner supporting this reform? At the same time, would we see federal agency quickly put together regulations needed to implement these three ambitious laws? And would we see a big shift towards implementation and see projects coming across the country? Similarly, the next thing to watch is what happens at the state level. States will play a very important role in implementation of this law. So for example, if you think about California, the 5th largest global economy in the world, they have an ambitious plan for net zero by 2045. They also plan to create 4 million jobs through this process. Or Georgia, for example, which has a Republican governor, which is attracting $20 billion investment in this new economy. Each one of these states, whether it's Republican control or Democratic control, are taking these steps to attract new investment, new jobs in their states. Would we see this take place across the country, all states, by which actually rooting this transition in the economy throughout the country? The next thing to watch for is how consumers and business will react to this opportunity. The laws provide incentives or subsidies for heat pumps, solar panels, energy efficiency. If families took advantage of all of them, the estimates show each family can save $10,000 per year through this process. So imagine that. We used to think this transition to climate-friendly, low-carbon living would be actually more expensive. It turns out these laws are trying to make it beneficial for us to do so. Why? Because as more families adopt these technologies, the solutions, it creates a bigger market. It brings the prices down. It makes other people also use them. It scales the solution. Similarly, would we see businesses do the same? We already see this in the United States, of investments plans being made by businesses. One of the interesting examples is a Pennsylvania company is trying to put together a $4.5 billion project in Louisiana for carbon capture. That will not only create hundreds of jobs, but bring innovation, a new solution that's needed in the system. Would we see such innovations actually proliferate across the country? The next thing to watch is whether they will be successful in their Justice 40 goals. Will government agencies follow through on the equity commitments and address historical disparities? Two examples of this: the EPA has a program for electric buses, and they plan to make sure electric bus fleets are available to every community across the world in every state. Second, the White House plans to publish a Justice 40 scorecard. I think this transparency is a very critical part to making sure we make progress, because the scale at which this Justice 40 initiative is the investment is unprecedented. We need to learn what works and what doesn't and keep improving. Would we see this take root? The next thing to watch will be how more states develop transition programs to support workers. For example, Colorado has a plan to actually support its coal workers to new job training for the new economy. Would we see more programs like this that directly support workers take place across the country? The last thing to watch is how other countries will react to this historic legislation. Actually, we already see some trade tensions rising with America's closest partner, the EU. EU leaders have used words like protectionist, unheard of for a long time in context of the American economy. We think such tensions actually will most probably go away. President Macron's visit recently was very helpful, and both sides, EU and the United States, have pledged to actually resolve those issues. We think something opposite actually will happen. Rather than this discussion tension, countries will try to emulate what the United States is trying to do. A large country and its elected leaders is purposefully trying to steer an economy in a particular direction, a low carbon, more equal, more innovative direction. Actually, EU, in spite of their complaints on protection, is already trying to do that. They're doubling down on the EU Green Deal, which is a very similar set of legislation. Would we see other countries emulate something and put together a just and green transition for their economy? So the question for us is this historic set of legislation in the United States, would it accelerate progress in the United States to a just economic transition? And would this progress in the United States actually encourage others, excite other countries to put together similar legislation that starts a process of creating just transitions in those countries, not only greening the economy, but making it good, making it beneficial to everyone in those countries? Would we see a just transition across the world? Hope you enjoyed these 4 stories. Together, we think these stories will drive the direction the world is heading to. The big question is, will these remain just stories, or will they unleash systemic shifts that the world really needs? This is what WRI is all about. We on WRI try to understand what drives change. What are the systems behind the outcome we see? We try to understand them and learn how to shape them for a better outcome for the world. I really want to thank you for joining us. I really want to thank all our partners and supporters who make possible our work, make these stories possible. Thank you very much for being here.